Okay, I'm going to get started. So welcome to our webinar giving you the how on the American Rescue Plan Act and Parent Voice. The Michigan PTA is providing this informational webinar for our PTA and PTSAs and members. Just a reminder, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. So briefly, this is our agenda for the evening. I'll give a brief introduction of who we are, background on COVID funding package, explanation of the American Rescue Plan Act, what advocating in your district and what that advocacy could look like. So my name is Karen Meyer. I am the federal PTA, the Michigan PTA Federal Legislative Chair. I'm a member of the Michigan Board of PTA Board of Directors, and I am the advocacy chair for the Norfolk PTA Council. With me tonight is Jen Garland. She is the co-chair of the Michigan PTA Advocacy Committee. She is also on the Michigan PTA Board of Directors, and she is the Farmington Area PTA Council VP of Advocacy. And last but not least is Susie Crafton. She is the Walled Lake Consolidated School District member of the Michigan PTA Advocacy Committee, and she is the Walled Lake PTSA Council Advocacy Chair. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jen Garland to discuss COVID relief packages and the American Rescue Plan.
So we thought we would start with just a basic primer on how education funding comes from the national level down to the local district. So the first step is that the US legislature, your members of Congress, decide that they want to give school funding to school districts in each state, and they allocate some money to which the United States Department of Education makes rules about how that money can be dispersed. So both of those things have to happen. The legislature has to allocate some funding, and the United States Department of Education has to make the rules about how that funding will be dispersed. Then the funds are dispersed to the states, and each state legislature creates rules on how to allocate the funds to their local districts. Once the state legislature has decided that they're going to allocate some funding, the State Department of Education makes the rules for the local districts on how they can use that money and communicates those rules to the local districts. Then the local districts submit their application that aligns with the state rules back to the State Department of Education. Once the State Department of Education receives an approved application for the funding, then the state disperses the funding to the local district, and the locals can use the funds for benefiting students. Next slide. In this particular instance, we're talking about the American Rescue Plan Act, which is an enormous act that passed on March 11th of this year, and includes, as one small part of it, a dedicated funding stream to help schools to safely reopen and to address the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just like all the previous COVID relief packages, it provides some dollars towards school districts. In this case, specifically over $122 billion across the country for all 50 states. Unlike previous plans, however, it requires that states and school districts get input regarding how the money is spent. We have a few definitions for you for the abbreviations we keep throwing around. So the first one is ARPA, which we just talked about, the American Rescue Plan Act. ESSER is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. You will hear a lot about ESSER funding. An SEA is a state education agency, and here in Michigan, the state education agency is the Michigan Department of Education. An LEA is a local education agency, and the LEA may be your local school district or your ISD, and an ISD is an intermediate school district. There are some rural parts of the states where you might not have a local school district, but you'd be a member of an intermediate school district. Next slide. So we do know how much Michigan has been allotted from the ARPA Act. Michigan has been given, let me get this right, $3,719,833,128 of school funding. The school districts are going to receive 90% of that, which is $3,347,849,815. And the 10% left over goes to the state education agency, Michigan Department of Ed, and they get $371,983,313. Of that piece, I think if you click it, it does an animation, Karen.
This piece here?
Yeah. At least I saw it before. Nope, it doesn't. Oh, there it goes. Of that, the state education agency can use only $18,599,166 to go for administrative purposes. Now you can do the next slide. So the big difference about this funding is that there is a public input requirement. Districts will each receive different amounts, but the need for them to involve the community stakeholders remains the same, regardless of what their specific per pupil allotment is. And that involvement is one of the rules of the allocation from the federal legislation, and it has a time limit to it. These time limits are very short, and they have to give opportunity for public comment and feedback. So stakeholders getting a say in how the money is spent is a big difference.
Okay, thank you, Jen. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to going off of what she said about what the act is and what kind of advocacy is appropriate under the Michigan American Rescue Plan Act. The Michigan Department of Education and local school districts have constraints around how they can spend these funds, which means that the PTA has to target our advocacy as well. So one of the main things that I want to address about what PTA should advocate on isn't just what, but also mainly who. So who isn't being included in these discussions? This is always true that our PTA should be reaching out to underserved groups in our school communities, but including these groups is mandated by the American Rescue Plan Act and should be seen as an opportunity for the PTAs to reach out as well and make sure our districts are including them. So it's specifically outlined that in the American Rescue Plan Act, who should be included in these discussions. This list of the first 8, the low-income families, all racial and ethnic groups, gender, students with disabilities, English learners, migratory students, families experiencing homelessness, and children and youth in foster care should be included. Your PTA should also advocate for the inclusion of other relevant community organizations, teachers, relevant student organizations, and paraprofessionals. Ask your district specifically how they are including these groups and how they plan to maintain that connection throughout this process. This is an ongoing process. I believe that the conclusion of this is 2024. So about every 6 months, your district should be engaging with how it's going with the funding process. So we need to make sure that these groups are continuously, their voices are continuously included. I really see this as an opportunity for us to engage with underserved community groups as a PTA and make sure those voices are heard in our districts as well. So back to how they can spend the funding. The American Rescue Plan, as Jen spoke about, is very specific on how this money can be spent. We have a lot of resources on the Michigan PTA website that speak to this. You'll find it under Michigan PTA/COVID-19 advocacy resources. So I really want to direct everyone there because it really helps spell out how we can spend the funding. But I wanted to talk about some big points about this funding package. First of all, your district must communicate on its website about what it's doing and how it's doing it. So for example, they must provide a reopening plan on its website 30 days after receiving funding. I know a lot of districts are already open, but that means that they need to to communicate how they're currently maintaining safety and what their future plans are for the next school year. 20% of funds have to address learning loss through evidence-based intervention. So how is your district defining evidence? Is it sharing this evidence with stakeholders? And how does it plan to use and share data that this intervention is working? So if your district is picking a program, why did they pick the program? How are they convincing community members that this is a good program to fit your school district's needs? And how is it planning on sharing with you that it's working in a continuous process? As I said already, you'll find on our website, Michigan PTA, the National PTA American Rescue Plan Act summary of K-12 education provisions for a full bullet point list of how your district can use funds. So we'd really like to direct people to see specifically, because it's very specifically laid out how these funds can be spent. And another excellent resource that we also have on the website is a frequently asked question document that was created by the United States Department of Education that really lays out specifically how, you know, when I talked about groups like students in foster care, how monies can be spent on this particular group of students and how they see that as being beneficial. So I would really direct you towards that FAQ to get a lot of detailed information about how the United States Department of Education is said is appropriate for how the money can be spent. Excuse me. I want to do a brief segue. I don't want, you know, between Jen and myself and going on to Susie, I don't want anyone to get overwhelmed by all this information that we're sharing. You do not have to be an expert on the American Rescue Plan Act. These resources are to help you, your PTA, and your school community. Your district should engage with you independent of your knowledge level. We should always be open to learning, and they should always be open to sharing information so that both parties can grow through this together. I don't want a feeling of overwhelm to be a hindrance to engagement. So always reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, because we're all going through this together. I know that the metaphor of building a plane while flying it has been totally overused this year, but this is just another example of that. We basically could have a fleet of planes at this point, but this is definitely true. Districts are learning through this, learning about this as we are. And so, you know, we need to continue to engage with them and just, you know, learn from each other and be open to that communication. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that 20% that is used to address learning loss, since it's a big chunk of the money. There is a wide definition of discretion left to the district in addressing this area. Examples could be an enrichment program for the next 2 years, summer programs, expanded hours, additional resources. All the money for the 20% to address learning loss can go into this category. So as you can see from reading that bullet point, why it would be important for PTAs to engage with their communities, since it's such a, even though it's a very big chunk and it's to address a very specific thing, that there's many different ways of going about that. So you know what's best for your school community. And then the money is a one-time use for allocation, so it cannot go to ongoing expenses like teacher salaries. Lastly, resources and data. Again, for the third time, the Michigan PTA website has a lot of excellent resources. For example, this My Blueprint for Comprehensive Student Recovery that was created by the governor's resource task panel to figure out how to work with specifically with Michigan students is on there. You can find that on there as well as the other resources that I discussed earlier. And then I also want to point you to your district's website. This mydistrictisamazing.org is a fake website. I'm sure you find your district amazing. On your amazing district's website, you should find reopening plans, test scores, district plans, and hopefully this website can be a resource for you in how you can engage with your district. Now I'm going to turn it over to Susie.
Thanks. So as Karen pointed out, you do not have to be an expert on the intricacies of school finance or the American Rescue Plan Act. When you're asking to get involved, we recommend a simple three-step process. So Ideally, you're going to share what you've learned today and the resources on our website with your PTA members. You're going to go to the district website and see if they've already announced how they're gathering input, what meetings are being hosted, or if they've already done that, it's unlikely at this point, but how they're announcing their spending of their money. The state level plans aren't due until June 7th. So remember, the state makes the rules and then it goes to the locals. So the state's plan is June 7th. It's most likely your district's plan is going to happen this summer. So keep an eye on your district website to see if they've made announcements about how they're going to be gathering input. Assuming they haven't made those decisions or announcements yet, the next place to go would be to ask your PTSA council if they have heard anything, if you have a council in your district. If you don't have a council, I would start with asking your school leader. Your school leader might know or they might not know what the plans are, but they at least can be a conduit of information between you and the district if you don't have relationships within your district. The third step would be to email your superintendent and or other district employees to ask them how they plan to address this involvement requirement. We have a PDF, I'm sorry, a template of an email that you might want to use to send to your superintendent. You can also share the national PTA PDFs that have been created and offer to help. Like Karen said, we are all in this together, and the processes are evolving as states make their plans, and that's going to influence locals. So I'm sure that your district leadership will be happy, willing to have some help in getting parents and other stakeholders involved. Once those timelines are announced, you can share the timeline and ask your district to alert you to the plan once they have a plan for how they're going to gather involvement. Next slide. So across the three of us that have been speaking to you today, we came up with a handful of tips of the trade. So on the list of things you should think about doing, you're going to want to talk about how learning loss or social emotional learning priorities are needed in your district. I find that personal stories are typically most compelling. So, if you have an experience or you have a member that has had an experience with their child's learning, that helps the administrators understand a name, a face, and a real situation, and it's less abstract. You can share those strategies in a planning meeting, or you can attend a school board meeting and file your district's procedures to do public comment at the board meeting. This is a great way to elevate the awareness across your school district community that involvement is mandatory. As we pointed to in a prior slide, make sure to include all family groups in your discussions, and try to make the language accessible to folks. You might want to start with sharing that very first slide that Jen walked us through with how money flows. That's not super intuitive. And so helping people understand that that is the way money flows to schools will just help people engage better in the process. Be polite, positive, and persistent. I can share that, the first time I reached out to my superintendent, the response was, "Thank you so much for the help. We don't have our plan yet. We're waiting for the state to tell us what needs to happen. You're on our list." I didn't take that as you're not going to be involved. I took it at exactly what he meant. We're building another plane as we fly it, and he doesn't know the rules yet. When he knows the rules, he'll be in touch. That means that I put on my calendar to reach back out 2 weeks from now and ask again, because I'm sure he has a lot more to worry about right now than if I'm involved in the planning, right? So polite, positive, and persistent is the way to go. Lastly, on the dues, remember that there's a team of us at Michigan PTA here ready to help. No question is silly, no question is dumb, and we probably need to do our own research to even be able to answer your question. So don't feel like there isn't a question you should ask. Please do. Okay, next slide. And here's some things to try to not do. Please don't be surprised if your school leader or a district employee doesn't actually know anything about this yet. It is totally evolving, and the success is if they say, let me find out and get back to you. Please don't assume ill intent. To that prior point, districts are learning about this as they go. Information is changing regularly, just like it did throughout this whole school year. So flexibility, patience, and generosity of spirit is the way to approach this. Please don't feel overwhelmed as the school year ends. Districts are going to be revisiting these plans until 2024. So you can certainly make a mark and an impact here, even if it's not in the last 2 weeks of the year, where, boy, it feels like we're cramming 15 months of activities into these weeks. Don't give up. It's a busy time of year. PTA leadership is changing over. This is probably going to be work that happens largely in the summer, which PTAs aren't normally used to doing great, unit level communication in the summer. So just keep persisting. And then lastly, don't lose sight of our purpose. Our efforts here really will make the student experience better. And so keep at it. I'm going to turn it back over to Karen to manage any last questions and close us out.
Are there any questions? Okay, it doesn't sound like there are any questions. Well, if there are any questions, please let us know how we can help. Feel free to email any of the three of us. We are more than ready, willing. I'm not going to say able, because like Susie said, we might have to, figure it out with you, but we will. So we are wanting to help get through this with you. And then if you have any questions or comments or concerns about this presentation or anything PTA related, you can always call the Michigan PTA. And I'm going to say again, the Michigan PTA website, if you haven't been on, has been updated. It's very lovely, and you can find a lot of resources on many different areas PTA related, but specific to this, under COVID-19 related advocacy, you'll find a lot of the resources that we shared today. Oh, I see a question. Oh, okay, well, thank you. So, oh, we did that in under 30 minutes. So I see this as a process, like Susie said. I hope that this has been informative to everyone, and looking forward to continuing the discussion into the future. So with that, I'm going to stop recording.